Hello listeners, this is Triathlon Science, the podcast that combines the latest research with a dash of myth-busting to make you faster, stronger and more resilient. Hello and welcome to another episode of Triathlon Science. Today's episode is going to be all about two interesting subjects of mine based on two questions I was asked. The first subject we're going to be talking about is mitochondria, and it's kind of expanding on a few things that I've said over the last particularly few weeks in regards to a few podcasts. I just wanted to kind of expand a bit more on what it's all about really, why you should be thinking about why this is idea of kind of minding your mitochondria, why they're so important for exercise, longevity and all other different bits and pieces related to that. So it's going to be a bit of a commentary talking about all those different elements, so hopefully won't go too far into the weeds, hopefully won't be too kind of science heavy. I'm going to try and bridge that to try and give you the salient points, but it kind of gives you an idea of why why I recommend the training types that I do, what we need to be thinking about, and how it kind of changes based on things like our age and how long we've been in the sport and different other factors. The second subject I'm going to be talking about is supplements. I've been asked quite recently by a few different people what kind of supplements, if any, that I take, and I'm going to go through what I do, why I take them, and what times. So, as always, this podcast is sponsored by Tri-Mechanics Coaching. We are opening the doors for next year, so get in touch if you're interested in triathlon and cycling running coaching. And the other point, as I've been keep on making, is the Leeds studio is closing at the end of November. So if you wanted to get in the Leeds studio to have a running analysis, then please get in touch ASAP. We've only got a few slots left because we're getting kind of booked up over the next couple of weeks, but there's 25% off if you want to come in the next few weeks before we close. So, the first subject, talking about mitochondria. So, I'm not going to go really fully into the details of what mitochondria actually are, because you can delve into this kind of world of, on a microscopic level, of what the mitochondria actually do. Plus also, it's not my subject, to be honest, and I think it's something that I've tried to learn as much as I possibly can about, but it is absolutely huge amount of information. The problem is that probably 99% of that information you're never going to want to know, and by having all that information, it's really going to struggle your ability to comprehend the salient points. And that is the problem with a lot of this stuff nowadays. That's the problem with the way things have changed. The way things used to work when it became to these kind of things is you had experts in the subject, in the field, who did their PhD research, then did further research, and they were able to share on their kind of knowledge through books and various other resources. But now everyone's got a little bit more interest in these things, and the internet particularly has become a wealth of all this different information. You can go down these rabbit holes, and it means that you actually maybe miss essentially the way I describe it is that you miss the whole forest because you are examining the small part of one leaf. You know, that's what things end up happening with these kind of things. So what are the mitochondria though? They're the kind of energy producing parts of the cell, and that's a massive over kind of simplification. Anyone that's really involved in this research is probably pulling their hair out at the idea that is what they do, because yes, that is their kind of main feature, but there's so much more to it. I'm going to try and give those points in this kind of relatively brief podcast. I'm going to try and keep it shorter than 20 minutes at the very most. So please, if you think that you're not going to deal with the science side of things, don't switch off yet. So just try and hold on to a few of these bits and pieces, because you will learn some bits when it comes to the science. It will help you understand what's going on, but also there's a wider implication to this. This is not just about endurance sport. So I have a kind of my subjects, the things I'm most interested in, have definitely shifted over the past few years. I've become far more interested in longevity. So this idea of living healthily to an older age. And I'm absolutely fascinated by it. So if you are interested in this, which I kind of urge a lot of people to really start kind of paying a bit more attention to this. The book by David Sinclair, Why We Age, is absolutely critical, really. It really paints a picture of the fact that aging is not a necessary process from the perspective of there is a certain level of aging with the cells, and you have to take what's said within the book sometimes quite lightly, because a lot of research that David himself does is on the pharmacological side and increasing aging in cells of yeast and mice and various other essentially kind of lower order animals, and it may not fully apply to humans. But also the pharmacological side is difficult because some of the supplements and things that he talks about in the book aren't really available over here, and they're certainly not available on a budget, shall we say. And the issue is that we still don't know the impacts, but some of the points that he makes that maybe I think he doesn't labour on enough are that actually there's things you can do in your current life and how you live that may have a big impact on your long-term longevity. So why is longevity important? Every time this is mentioned, people go, well, I don't want to live forever. So this isn't about living forever. This is about living well. This is about living healthily. I have a friend of mine who comes to see me, and I keep forgetting his age, but he's in his 70s now, and it is ridiculous how fit and healthy he is. If he ever listens to this podcast, he'll know exactly probably that I'm talking about him. But it's incredible how fit and healthy he is because he looks after himself. So you don't need to feel like life kind of falls off the end of a cliff. The reason I'm really interested in this is that I'm coming up to my mid-30s, and I'm taking a big hiatus from the sport. The reason being is because I've got a young son and a young family, and I'm trying to really focus on them more than anything else. But the other thing I'm thinking about is that, I don't really sleep well at all. My wife doesn't sleep well at all. Our young son is a pretty terrible sleeper still, and as a result, we've had lots of infections and various other things. And I can't really do the sport the way I want to. I'm trying to do little bits and pieces to kind of keep myself ticking over. But if I don't come back to the sport for the next few years, I'm kind of okay with that. The reason I like the idea of longevity is because it's not about that I would live to 150. It's that I would predictively live to 100, which means I'm only a third of way through my life. And then I could be living healthy, strong, fit, and able to do triathlons to the level I want to do it into my 40s and 50s, which there are people I know that are doing that. There are phenomenal athletes that are into their mid-40s and going up towards 50s. So I want to hold that in place because I've got a few little niggles, injuries, and problems with my hips and things, and I don't want to feel like when my son is a little older and I do get to sleep that I can't do the sport that I love. So that's why I'm interested in longevity, but I really am interested in relation to how it then you can relate that to how people are now at kind of my age, but also how it relates to sport. Because the more we study longevity and disease and diseases like diabetes and various, that we get more information about how it relates to endurance exercise. There's a reason why exercise is the most potent method in any of these things. So you listen to, as I say, David Sinclair's book, and he might talk about certain drugs, certain things like metformin, certain things like NAD, which is a kind of cell molecule in the cell. And the end result is that all these things that you might be able to try and change with supplements are almost certainly impacted by exercise. And that's the critical thing a lot of these people are thinking about. They are only, or some of them are only thinking about these supplements in older age because they don't have the ability to exercise. So we can see how these are common pathways. But actually I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's the case really. So what do the mitochondria actually do then? Well, they produce our cellular energy. So they essentially, and the way I actually love the way that this was described on a recent podcast talking about oxygen. Now, oxygen is viewed, we view oxygen as essential, yet we've heard of these things called free radicals and various things that cause damage within the cells and essentially cause aging. Well, they are as a result of burning oxygen. So yeah, oxygen is essential, but what happens, oxygen is very much this kind of Goldilocks thing. If we have too little of it, so if we have lung disease, if we have heart disease, all these things which inhibit the ability of oxygen getting to the cells when they need it, we die. We need a certain amount of it. What happens if we get too much of it, though? And that's something that's not very well studied. Because actually, when we have too much of it in a cell, we have massive problems. And we get more of those oxygen-free radicals, we get more damage because the oxygen is damaging, it shouldn't be there. We've always used this idea of looking at things that rust, showing the actual impact of oxygen. Oxygen oxidizes, it damages. So, and that actually goes on within our body. just not a lot of it in exactly the same way. So what do the mitochondria do? Well, they're like sinks. They sit there in the cell, and as the oxygen comes in and diffuses in, it diffuses like a sink, like a wormhole to these mitochondria. So that's the first point. If the oxygen has got into your cell, the more mitochondria that are using the more oxygen or doing a better job of respiring, then the better. And that's the thing, they get rid of a lot of that oxygen to turn it into energy. They get rid of it to turn it into our energy currency. So when they're not working very well, you get damage, you get things going wrong. And this is where we think that there's a root of the relationship to certain diseases, things like cancer, diabetes, and all these diseases, maybe underpinned in some way by dysfunctions in the mitochondria, meaning they're not functioning as well, they're not sucking the oxygen, we're getting more damage, we're having to repair more on these processes. But also in endurance exercise, or in any exercise, they're going to help us produce the basically energy aerobically. And that produces energy very cleanly, should we say, is probably the best way to describe it. When we produce energy anaerobically, which is when we're doing normally short bursts without oxygen, we build up metabolites that have to be got rid of, that have to be used for elsewhere. We produce lactate. Now, the first thing I want to go on from the side and talk about lactate is that it's not all bad at all. It's not all bad at all, actually. It's a marker. It's a marker, and it can be, and this is another interesting point I want to make, is it can be a marker of when our mitochondria aren't functioning very well. So it actually can be used in metabolic disease to show when your lactate is abnormally raised or raised with almost the slightest amount of exertion, it might be that your mitochondria are not functioning properly, and therefore you are ending up producing more lactate because you are respiring anaerobically. So if you have more lactate, you can respire, you can produce more energy within the cells, within the muscle, without needing to produce lactate, without needing to produce toxic metabolites that may, the hydrogen ions and various things that might need to be basically got rid of, moved elsewhere and creating problems. So the end up is that our training needs to focus on mitochondria and understanding how they work and also how to improve them. And that's the problem with a lot of the way that we focus on training, is we've often focused on things like VO2 max, which is a composite value of how much oxygen we can use. And obviously that is related to our mitochondria. If your VO2 max is increased, there's lots of things, there are lots of processes that probably have happened. But one of them that's likely to have happened is your mitochondria have got better at burning the oxygen. That has created more of a, essentially, an ability. So as the oxygen comes in, as it goes around the blood, because it doesn't actually dissolve properly in liquid. So as they carry around the blood in the blood cells, and the red blood cells drop it off at the tissues, it then diffuses into the cell, and at that point it gets pulled into the mitochondria. Well, obviously if your mitochondria have gone up in their ability to do that, they can actually pull in more oxygen, and less then will end up going back out. Essentially you will take more from your lungs, and that's what you're measuring. So often people think as they are breathing oxygen, they are breathing pure like oxygen in, and they take all of it out of the air and none of it comes back out again, and that's not the case. We breathe in a lot of oxygen, we breathe out a lot of oxygen, because it's only however much we can use. So presumably, normally if our VO2 max has gone up, then it partly things like our mitochondria have got an increased ability. So all these things have crossover. That's the first thing to bear in mind, is there's definitely no, this is the way you train to increase your mitochondria. But the thing about the mitochondria is that they are probably, if you imagine, so let's imagine in your head, you've got this power plant. So it always reminds me of playing a game called Total Annihilation, which is, for people of my generation, was a game on the PC where you kind of had built armies and various other things. There was Command and Conquer as well, also very similar. And this idea that you started from nothing and then you built things like power. I always liked Total Annihilation because you had to build things like power plants and various other things. And what you then did is you built more of the really basic ones. So you started off, you could only build wind turbines. And you built wind turbines, they didn't create much energy. Then as you got better, you built loads of wind turbines, and then you could turn those wind turbines into eventually nuclear power plants. Which when you had one of those, you got rid of 100 of these relatively poor quality wind turbines and produce ridiculous amounts of energy that could sustain you for the rest of the game. So I always defined that was basically the aim of the game, was to produce a nuclear power plant, and then you could produce all the army elements that you need to produce. It's kind of like how I think about with mitochondria. We can produce more of them. We can also increase their ability to produce energy. We can make them better. And that's the thing, is we don't understand all these different really elements. It's very difficult to measure all these like kind of inputs and decide and try and work out what's doing what. But we kind of are starting to understand and put something together when we're measuring molecules. Like I talked about things like PGC1 alpha, which is it's a kind of a transcription factor, so it's all about the genetic side, producing more mitochondria. AMPK, the energy factor, and these things. We are starting to put together how it might improve our mitochondria. But the other thing to bear in mind is that a lot of the hardware related to things like VO2 max, as an example, things like the capillaries, the actual transport system going into your muscles, beyond a certain age, our ability to actually develop that is really slim. I'm looking at my my young lad now. He's coming up to a year and a half, and his hands are tiny. His body is tiny. He's growing so fast. He's actually building stuff. His muscles, everything, are being filled up with capillaries. I haven't grown like that for a very long time, and there's a point where you're not going to grow a lot of those capillaries. That's why the biggest predictor of essentially ability in certain sports is playing sports when you're a kid, particularly aerobic side. That's why things like swimming, highly aerobic sports causing lots of breathing, means that the lung capacities and these of swimmers is often quite high. They often don't have the highest absolute VO2 maxes like people like cross-country skiers, because they don't use a lot of their muscle mass and they're well supported. But their lung capacities and these things are huge because they drove that by swimming a lot when they were kids. And so a lot of those processes, I've always said, when you get to a certain age, those processes don't really improve. They might improve mildly, and that improvements in the measure of VO2 max, which is that end point, potentially are unrelated to those things. It might be that things like capillarization doesn't improve at all. It might be that it's all about the mitochondria. It's all about the things, because we know that they can change. Every few days, you change your mitochondria. You rebuild, you break down, you do all these things. Anything that happens that fast is amazing because it has that ability, or it has if you focus on it, you can get improvements relatively quickly, but also it shows you where the body can actually change its focus, where you can actually make improvements. Because if things take months, maybe years, in the best case scenario to improve, what is your likelihood of being able to sustain an improvement in those structures over a long period of time? So that's why I'm really focused about mitochondria. So going back to, what are the intensities, what are the things you need to do to improve your mitochondria? Well, if you're interested in the carbohydrate manipulation side of things, listen to the podcast I did about that. But that gives you an insight into the fact that mitochondria need some kind of level of stress, often that is applied for a significant period of time, and then potentially an area of fasting. The reason I say fasting is because the work by Sachin Panda and the time-restricted eating, they seem to have found that endurance is improved with a longer fast period overnight. And they believe, and the research is converging on this now, is that because that period allows a time period where the mitochondria can essentially be broken down, replaced and rebuilt. Because if they are constantly having to deal with energy all the time, and if you are eating for almost every hour of the day, which a lot of people are, and they're eating right up to bedtime, and then the second they get up the next morning, you may not allow a big enough window for repair and recovery. But we also think that potentially things like having a low cellular carbohydrate state, as demonstrated by Sleep Low, that switches on AMPK, that does all these things that then have a downstream effect, is also very, very potent. And the thing is that the changes that were noted in those studies required a lot of effort, and then a lot of, essentially, a big restriction. So you can imagine, if you're not putting in those kind of efforts and not doing that kind of restriction, potentially you're not really getting a lot of improvement in your mitochondria. And I think this is the thing, is I often see athletes who have trained over the years and years and years and years, and they've done the similar kind of training, but they've never tried any of these strategies. They've always referenced training with lots of food. They've never been, they are never been in a state where they're in any way compromised. That's the thing. They may train hard very briefly, and this goes back to the VO2 max argument. So the session that I do for Sleep Low, or the session that is prescribed, it's not really a VO2 max session. It's harder. It's easier, but longer. It's just easier and quite a bit longer, because the actual study was 5 by 8 minutes. Now 8 by 5 minutes with a minute break, at about 82% of MAP. So that is probably just below. It's somewhere between what you functional threshold and VO2 max power, somewhere in that mark. So you're probably looking at about 105, 106 to up to 109%, whereas most people would probably do their VO2 max intervals at 110 to 120%. They maybe do 3 minutes on, a couple of minutes off, or something similar, and they probably only would accumulate, most people in a VO2 max session would probably not accumulate more than 20 minutes of actual work. Let's say 5 by 4 minutes, 20 minutes of actual work, whereas actually in this study they were going significantly longer, double that, and it's obviously quite a significant difference, because that's what you kind of need to do to work on the mitochondria. Well, if you're always training your VO2 max and doing relatively short bursts of sessions, and you're only on the bike for, let's say, an hour, you won't really do the kind of depletion, the glycogen depletion you really need. You probably have a carb trunk and things, and that's the things. People would have carbs before, carbs during, carbs after. They don't get this depletion, therefore there may be not that actual pressure, because the thing is if you think about it, as I just said, if you've got lots of really well-functioning mitochondria and you are putting out oxygen, it is likely that the blocking point isn't the ability to necessarily use that oxygen. There may be no stimulus there for the body to go, well, actually, we need some more mitochondria. So that's the critical thing, I think, is that actually having the low carbohydrate state seems to send a kind of novel stimulus that is a slightly different stimulus to maybe what some of us are used to be able to actually switch on mitochondria, or switch on the production of them in a way we didn't do before. The other side of training that I really like to do is I like to do training around lactate threshold 1, so LT1. I like to do a kind of torque test to try and find where this little trickle of lactate starts going to the blood. Now, it is obviously a proxy. The best way to measure it would be in a lab with a lactate monitor, but that's very difficult to get hold of. So I try and use a proxy of breathing, and I get my athletes to do a test where they have to it relates to their breathing and when the breathing changes, because that gives an idea of when the lactate has trickled into the blood, because that's a stimulus to then breathe more, to try and breathe off the CO2 and these other factors involved. But the reason I quite like training around there is because that demonstrates that point at which the lactate is spilling out, where we're producing a bit of anaerobic, and that's where I think there's a potent stimulus to, if we can keep it up for a long period of time. So you have to do this for, half an hour and a half, long blocks of it, because that, if you keep that stimulus for long enough, I believe that area there also would provide a stimulus to try and not only reuse the lactate through reuptake into other muscle cells, but also increase the pressure to produce or work on more mitochondria. And obviously the other side of things is the kind of longevity, going back to that side of things, is that actually this will increase your health. If your mitochondria increase in health, it's likely you'll be able to deal with fluctuations in energy, both up and down. So when you have a bit too much energy and a bit too much food, you can deal with that. If you have a bit too essentially you're in a low energy state, you can burn more available fat, because mitochondria are fantastic at what's called beta oxidation, or burning fat aerobically. And if the better they are, the more you've got and the more they have the ability to do that, the better you can burn fat when you don't have available carbohydrates around to burn aerobically. So I'm going to leave that there. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why I go on a lot about mitochondria, why I believe it is what the primary focus, particularly in a masters athlete, an aging, and any athlete that's essentially over about 25 to 30, because the hardware stuff is diminishing their ability, but there is so much more you can do. There has to be a shift in training focus. I think having a bit of having a bit of VO2 max work is good, because maybe it's actually because of the lactate you produce during that we know there's a stimulation related related to PGC1 alpha producing lactate, and this whole kind of complex that actually produces mitochondria as well. So it's not just about, so don't take away that I say don't do VO2 max work because it doesn't produce a long enough stimulus. Probably worth having that in, because we know that VO2 max does help preserve fitness, particularly when you're older. But think about adding these more kind of manipulative processes to try and focus on those mitochondria, because I think that's where the biggest bang for your buck comes. So the second half of the podcast, I'm going to talk about supplements. So I get asked a lot, what supplements do you take? And actually, I get a lot of different responses. Some people would expect me, from what I've said, from the things that I talk about, the fact that I talk a lot about food and these things, to say, no, I don't take any supplements ever. I get everything I need from my diet, and I have a brilliant diet. And I think that's absolute rubbish. Pretty much nobody I've ever known or ever spoken to gets everything they need from their diet anymore, because actually it's very difficult these days. I've mentioned it a few times that I've moved out now to I live near towards Selby. The nearest supermarket that we use quite a lot is Aldi. Aldi is quite limited in its range of foods, and I've lost at least 10 types of foods that I don't get as regularly. I get them when we get Tesco orders and things, but I don't have things like, I used to have mussels once a week, and these things that have so many different vitamins, minerals and these things. And I've in the end, I've had to start bridging gaps, thinking about supplementation, both with micronutrients and macronutrients. So both the kind of micro side of things, the small side of things, but bigger supplements and that side of things, thinking to try and replace those things. So I do add a lot of things into my diet from various different elements. The idea of a supplement, the name of a supplement really is that it is supplementing the diet, and I think that's a bit of a grey area. So I use some of these because some of them are akin to food, but they also, as I said, they add in bits that I can't seem to get from elsewhere. So, and I do try my best to get things from whole foods. So, for instance, having iodine occasionally is really important. You can buy an iodine supplement, but I don't think that's a really good idea. Particularly, we don't know the impact it has on having high doses. So, I got a little packet of seaweed. I have a little, I think it's wakame seaweed. It's about £2 off Amazon. You can buy it in some supermarkets, obviously not in Aldi. And it's 2 little kind of tiny pieces that you are rehydrate. It's about 50 grams probably, and it's lasted, you have a few of those a week, like, as I say, a few pieces of it rehydrated, or some people mill it up and sprinkle it on salads and things to get a nice kind of, it's got a really salty kick. So that's the kind of thing you can use when you choose food sources. Things like nuts are fantastic as having a nice range, but making sure you go across the whole range is important. So I make sure we get mixed nuts with walnuts, Brazil nuts. Now Brazil nuts, they are always the thing that you say, well, they're full of selenium. Well, they're really not anymore at all, because they all come from Bolivia now, and Bolivia doesn't have much selenium in the soil, so Brazil nuts from Bolivia don't have much selenium. So I have been in the past tempted to supplement with selenium because of that reason. I still think it's potentially worth looking into, because it's really important for things like reproductive health, and I don't believe you get the same selenium at all from what we get in terms of Brazil nuts these days. But you can get a little bit from the Brazilian or the Bolivian Brazil nuts. So those are the kind of things that, I'm thinking about. I'm trying to get these things. I have a huge range of different foods, and I try and keep my massive range of the vegetables that I can get, the British vegetables that you can get from Aldi, but it's still not huge. So I do add a few different bits and pieces in, but actually I tend to supplement a little bit more with things like, I use things like pea protein powder. So if I was to think about the kind of the big supplements, so the big bag, shall we say, the big bag of supplements that I add in, let's say I have a smoothie, because I quite like my kind of, I have a bit of a little bit of a kind of smoothie normally around kind of lunchtime with some bits and food, just because it means I can add in a few of these bits. And sometimes I use things like pea protein powder, potentially a little bit of whey protein as well, because I don't really eat much meat. Fish is quite hard to come by again from Aldi, so we have that, maybe I have once or twice a week I have a bit of fish. I don't really like a lot of meat. I don't like meat that's poor quality, badly farmed, etc. So it can be quite difficult. So I do rely on things like protein powders to add a little bit of extra protein into my diet to replace the need to have lots of meat. I don't really like having a lot of eggs. As I said on the last podcast, I've definitely changed my opinion a little bit on that, in that I don't think having I think having more than 2 or 3 eggs at one sitting, particularly, it increases risk if you don't know what's going on in terms of your cholesterol transport. I don't, so I'm not going to risk it. I may be absolutely fine. There are people that can probably live on 10 eggs a day and have no issues. But without knowing that stuff, I think it's probably better to be like slightly moderation. I think that having 2 eggs a day is absolutely fine, but I have it kind of a little bit around my kind of approach. But if you think that has maybe 12 grams of protein in, whereas we're looking at, as an athlete, you're trying to get 20 to 30 grams in each sitting, I add a little bit of extra pea protein and whey protein powder in. I also add a bit of collagen in. So collagen is something I've used quite a lot, because I think the evidence behind it for things like tendons and connective tissues is really good. It's also something that's not really much in our diet unless you eat the whole food. Again, very difficult to get what I used to get. I used to get things like, I used to go to the butchers and get loads of bones and make bone broth. I didn't need collagen. I didn't need to add it to my diet at all, but I can't do that anymore because it's very difficult to get to the butcher and get those things, and the butchers near me aren't quite as nice as the other ones. The other ones used to give me a load of bones and I used to make it all, it'd be great, whereas not the same anymore. Occasionally when I get a whole chicken, but again, I don't really like to, I like to make sure I can get good quality free range stuff, and it's actually a lot harder to come by. Even though we are in kind of farming country, it's mostly arable around us, as opposed to farms that may have better quality in terms of the meat and that side of things. So I add a little bit of collagen, use a little bit of collagen powder that I add into the kind of smoothie side of things. If I have one of those, I add a touch of inulin. So inulin is essentially the prebiotic that's found in things like onions and garlic, and it's fantastic. It is very, very good, an excellent prebiotic. But I find that if I have too much kind of onions and garlic, the actual other prebiotics in there, the fructans, tend to make me a bit bloated, whereas inulin on its own tends to be absolutely fine. It's a little kind of white powder, tastes a little bit like, it's got a weird kind of like, almost like candy floss type texture, like flavour, and it's a tiny amount that you only need a kind of teaspoon, and I add that to occasionally to a little bit of porridge and things as another little kind of supplementation. But I do that specifically because I would rather get my prebiotics from a range of foods, and I do have onions and garlic, but I find that they make me a bit bloated, and I always thought it was the inulin, but having had the inulin powder, it turns out it wasn't. So I use that a little bit occasionally. I have a little bit of creatine. So I don't take creatine from the kind of muscle building side of things. It's actually got really good evidence for the cognition and that side of things. If you've been through having a child and you are a little bit sleep deprived, you do anything to try and improve your cognition. So because of that side of things, I'd have a little dash of creatine, and I add into things as well occasionally. Again, these supplements I tend to try and get mostly through bulk powders or My Protein, that are the best sources that I can kind of find. Yes, you can probably find places that are going to say they're ultra tested, organic, all this kind of stuff, and I guess there are issues with some of those as to how well checked they are on the additives, the contamination and that side of things. I don't compete. I think if I was competing, again, maybe I'd check things to, and I do worry about some of those things, but I think those companies are pretty open about how much they're checking. And I think if there was issues with contamination with the two big companies, My Protein and bulk powders, I think we'd know about it. So I trust them quite a lot on those side of things. It's always difficult when you've got white powders to trust companies, but the other side of things with supplements is that they have a lot of additives in. I don't think I really trust having anything with silicon dioxide, magnesium stearate and various other things. I tend to avoid pills. I tend to try and either get a kind of pure powder, so I use things like magnesium citrate powder, pure. It doesn't, with no bulking, no fillers and no nothing. I don't really like tablets. Tablets are obviously very good for monitoring doses, but I tend to like little powders that I add into tiny bits of water or my food throughout the day. So I try and almost add them in as if they were part of my food. So rather than having a tablet that is a huge dose of something in one shot, I tend to try and just kind of, let's say, put them into maybe a smoothie or a bit of porridge or something to try and balance things out a little bit, so that I'm getting 90%, 95% whole foods, but also just topping things up. So as opposed to it being a separate issue or a separate thing, because I really don't think taking a supplement of a singular thing that's in a big dose with a load of bulking agents is probably not really a very good thing, and actually may end up causing issues. Things like zinc are a good example. If you take a big load of zinc and you don't have copper pipes, for an example, because all of us around here, we have copper pipes, so we do get a fair amount of copper that's kind of comes into the water through that, you can actually get copper deficiency from having too much zinc. So that's the things to bear in mind when you supplement, is that you could end up going the other way. So I have a bit of vitamin D. I tend to have a little bit of. I use the My Protein capsule, and I have about 2,500 I use kind of international units probably each day. And the reason I started doing that again was because I went off it for a long period of time, and I had my vitamin D level checked, and it wasn't low at all. It was just on the lower end, and obviously with the lots of infections around and things, I decided to just ever so slightly supplement it, because the evidence would suggest that adding 2,500 international units, I have it either per day, and normally I miss a day or two, would bring me up to the normal level, and I'm due to have that checked again sometime soon to check that level is okay. But it can be quite difficult when you're in the northern climate and you're not able to get out as much to get enough sun exposure. So I do think that it's worth having it checked. And if you don't have it checked, then maybe taking a kind of low dose supplement in the meantime, if you're happy. It's very difficult to generate toxicity on a kind of 2,500 international unit, even though it sounds a lot. There is very little evidence for toxicity unless you're hitting the kind of 10 to 15 to 20,000 international unit doses, but it's still worth getting things checked out. I definitely don't take things like iron. I have a little bit of red meat every so often. Most men particularly don't really need any kind of iron supplementation. I don't have a multivitamin because I don't feel like I need it. I use nutritional yeast, so I love nutritional yeast. It's like a kind of cheesy powder. Again, it's a food version, really, and it's lots of B vitamins, and it's got B12 and things in it. I tend to find, because I don't have much meat, I've got a propensity, because of my digestion isn't fantastic, to drop my B12 a little bit and end up with very slightly smaller than I'd like blood cells, which is the sign that's on the blood panel. So I have nutritional yeast, and as I say, I have it with, and I try and have a massive range if I can of vegetables, and like things like cabbages, broccolis, all those kind of things, and try and get the biggest range I can of all those different vegetables, all the different colours of the rainbow as it's described. You'll get all the phytonutrients and all those different bits and pieces. So that's most of all the kind of supplements that I take. I had a little bit of magnesium. I added a little bit of magnesium recently because it's helped me sleep. A bit of magnesium citrate, as I said. I had a dash of that in, but a very small amount. Again, magnesium is one of those things that we really should be able to get from our diet if we had a massive range, but actually is a little bit more limited. But also I find it just seems to help me sleep a little bit better. The other one I do use is glycine. I've always said to people, I think glycine is really useful. It's a very, very useful, and there's very fantastic evidence for it, both for controlling things like blood sugar, but also things like sleep, because it's the amino acids that we're not getting a lot of in our normal diet. We used to get it from the kind of connective tissues, and when we used to eat the whole animal and eat all the bits and pieces between the meat, but we don't really do that anymore. So we could do with a bit of glycine, and I think it's a fantastic thing to add in a little dash before you go to bed. So I actually have a little dash with something called tryptophan. So that's another thing that I add in. I add a bit of powdered tryptophan because I find that at the moment it really helps me sleep. It's very, very good for kind of rebalancing the kind of the stimulation essentially in the brain, and the kind of stimulation you get from caffeine and what's called essentially the adenosine. Kind of rebalances things in that side of things. I find it helps me sleep, which at the moment is really important, particularly with a little one, because I know that I got to get to sleep quickly because we're going to get woken up relatively soon. And that's the thing, is that when this is all kind of hopefully he's sleeping a little better, I probably won't bother with a lot of these things. A lot of these things are because of the situation I'm now in. So it's all about, not about taking supplements for supplement's sake. It's all about trying to replace what you're essentially what you've lost, or what you're not able to get hold of. So that kind of mostly covers, to be honest. I try and add in things like, I use a lot of cinnamon, Ceylon cinnamon. I add into things. I wouldn't regard that as a supplement. I'd regard that as food. But it's important, if you are going to have cinnamon, to have Ceylon type, not the supermarket cassia type. I've said about this a few times, but there is good research that even small doses of the cinnamon, that if you use more than 1 gram a day, which if you imagine, most people probably, if they're putting a spoon in their porridge, maybe are using more than 1 gram a day, actually can build up a toxin in the liver that can cause damage. So it's definitely worth getting the proper stuff, shall we say, which is the Ceylon cinnamon type, what's called true cinnamon. It's relatively cheap. You can get it from Amazon. You can get 250 grams for £5 that lasts you months. You know, if you imagine 250 grams is a lot of cinnamon. Add a bit of cocoa powder, a bit of chocolate, and those kind of things to things. I think they're for the phytonutrients and that side of things. Just trying to think through if there's anything else. I've got a little box that sits on top of the fridge. It's got these white packets in, and they're all used for different purposes. The other one that's quite interesting that I've started using or started trialling again is beta-alanine. So beta-alanine is a fantastic podcast, and I'll link to it on Fuel the Pedal with a guy that talks about the beta-alanine research, because it's always been a bit up and down. And it's always been used as this idea of increasing high-intensity exercise, because what it's called, what it is, it produces, or it increases the levels of intra kind of cellular carnosine. And carnosine is an intracellular buffer. What a buffer means is it buffers the acid. So when you produce high-intensity exercise or intensity, when you're doing intervals and you're producing hydrogen ions, the carnosine helps buffer that. But the interesting thing is it's often been used, or the way that most people think it's been used, is to have a kind of short-term effect. Whereas actually the research shows that you need to take it for maybe a few weeks to build up. You need to take about 6 grams a day for about 2 to 3 weeks. And then suddenly after 3 weeks you get enough of that carnosine to do a job. So most people wouldn't take it for that length of time. And they've actually shown in the research that's the only time you actually get the benefit, is if you take it. Now the reason I thought about taking it is it's relatively cheap, but also something I've always struggled with has been that high intensity. I've always had a massive drop off when I hit kind of VO2 max, just over VO2 max power, so I thought it's worth trying. But again, it's just a bit of fun, see what happens with that side of things. It's a relatively well regarded supplement. I don't think anything wrong with using those kind of things. And obviously, of course, the last one that I use a lot of is caffeine. I love my coffee, I roast my own beans, and so I definitely enjoy my caffeine. So, that's the end of today's episode. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you found some of those bits and pieces useful. Again, if you're interested in the coaching side of things, get in touch, and goodbye.